All right, well, welcome to the Gateway API community meeting. It is March 16th in this corner of the world. And this is the last meeting before KubeCon EU. And looking forward to all the folks that are going to be able to make it there. It's going to be some really great talks and good content. And our first ever Gateway API Developer Summit. So if you are not already planning on attending, please, reach out and make sure you do. That'll be the Monday before KubeCon, so a week from today. Um, yeah, so with that, yeah, Kubernetes community meeting. I think I recognize everyone on here. Usually I'd do a shout out for anyone new to say hi, but I think everyone's been around a couple times at least. So just jump into a pretty quick agenda. One thing I'll say is Nick is decidedly not on this call because he is in the process of flying towards KubeCon. So this may be a brief item on the list, but let's give it a shot. Keith, let's talk about egress, DNS, TLS. I don't know.
Yes. Sorry, I should have linked to the actual PR in there. And I can do that now. Yeah, I was hoping Nick was going to be able to make it, but we can have maybe a discussion nonetheless and get the opinions of you fine people. Um, so I'm pushing through the backend resource get. I've assigned it a number finally, so it feels sort of official. And one of the things that Nick brought up and has brought up consistently as we've talked through various iterations of this is the concern, and you're right there on that on the comment there, Rob. Um, the next one you were right there before. It's the next one. There you go. But as far as DNS, external DNS resolution within a Kubernetes resource, um, we've already talked a little bit in various forums about how this is not sort of the same concern as external name within Kubernetes service, but there is a concern here when it comes to allowing an application developer via a backend resource to be able to sort of tell the gateway to do a DNS request for some host name. And uh, basically, when the gateway does that request, the backend resource creator can set up a DNS entry somewhere and have it point to localhost, um, or 127.0.0.1, and essentially do um, depending on what is available at localhost, or a link local address like 169.254, etc. That backend client could find a way to get data from a gateway's link local address or localhost endpoints. So Nick and I go back and forth on how do we want to handle this. To set a little bit of extra context here for folks who might not be as familiar, this sort of functionality exists within Istio, within Linkerd. Um, it's been in Envoy Gateway as well. It's a general feature for L7 gateways slash proxies, to be able to do some DNS based service discovery. I saw an article from a couple of years ago that Nginx as a proxy and open source even supports this. Um, and we sort of go back and forth on some of the concerns and weighing the threat model versus the um, sort of the benefit of the feature. Um, I talked with John a little bit today about this, and well, sorry, I'm skipping ahead a little bit. So Nick brought up the point, and we talked about this a little bit here, that adding TLS might help a little bit with this scenario because if the client is expecting TLS, then the a localhost endpoint not having TLS would fail, and vice versa. But I talked with John Howard a little bit offline, and he mentioned, and he very astutely pointed out, that if you have own the backend resource, you can own the TLS and do insecure skip verify. Um, and so where we are today, sort of the current state for me is that I think the way we do this is to say that implementations that implements backend must secure localhost or link local endpoints with TLS on the server side or jot off just to confirm that um, the host names match up and that there is a degree of trust to prevent that sort of request forgery sort of uh, uh, attack. So that's it at a high level. Rob, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, I mean, this has been the evergreen concern of any, like this is roughly equivalent to the external name services debate and all the rest, right? That have been variations of how can we safely route traffic based on DNS names. And it's obviously not easy, but one of the things that strikes me as just hearing this discussion and trying to catch up on the thread is that this feels like a an obvious place for us to get ahead of the curve with some form of conformance covering. It would be fairly easy for us to contrive an example where a given DNS name resolves to localhost or any number of things, uh, link local, and then make sure that that's part of the conformance spec. That I don't know, we can define any number of reasonable ways to handle that, but as long as one of those is selected, I think that would help provide some safety here because this is an inherently uh, dangerous API, I guess I would say. Um, yeah, so that's my view. Lior, what are you thinking?
Yeah, I just have a quick question, like very small one. So I'm reading the last comment here on the thread. Was the point that the TLS on the resource? So the point John made that you mentioned is that the mandating TLS on the resource specifically doesn't allow us to understand that it can skip like verification, but like would having it done a different resource or policy mitigate it? Like obviously if the owner is the same, so not,
No,
but
I don't think it like
Yeah, it's the persona of the
no.
policy essentially. Even if the persona is not an admin, you're in the same boat
yeah.
essentially.
Yeah,
Yeah, so it doesn't matter like if it doesn't matter like that it's in the same resource or a different, just matter that the persona owns the same thing, right?
yeah,
Yeah, exactly.
Cool. Yeah.
yeah. So I mean, I feel like there's some. I'm not necessarily against it. I just this is something that has so many foot guns that we need to be sure we're doing it safely. So I think if we shift the focus to we need a here are the valid ways that you can handle this and then list them out and then just say we're going to have a conformance test that ensures that when DNS resolves to localhost, one of X things happens. That seems like our best possible case here.
Yep.
And localhost isn't the only, I guess I guess that conformance test may need to cover a few different variations of that. But anyway, that's the only way I can think to resolve this with some level of safety. I
It's
think
it's
TLS
basically
is
a
a
security threat, like threat modeling conformance test in a lot
yeah,
of ways. Like you're
yeah,
testing anything, like multiple things in the link local range, multiple things in the loopback range. For example,
yeah,
Istio uses 127.0.0.6. That's technically a valid IP. So like, yeah, we'll need to try to cover some basic ones just to make sure that implementations
yeah,
aren't just exposing it. I think to your point though, what's even almost more important than that conformance test is the documentation telling implementations, hey, if you're not
Yeah,
securing these endpoints, this is not a safe resource for you to implement.
yep, yep,
And I can add some language to that effect in
yep,
the get.
yep. Cool. This is I meant to come back to this. I said I would after we released, and I haven't found time yet. But are there other open threads that are worth discussing on this meeting? We have some time if you want to raise any other discussion
Ricardo had a
points.
hand up, wanted to see if he had anything
Oh,
to
sorry.
add
Yeah.
there.
Yeah, no, I was trying to remember. If I recall correctly, there is some part of Kubernetes controller, at least on the external name, where a local host, any attempt to point to local host, including NIP, it's blocked or something like that. I remember seeing, so if you do something like 127-0-0-1.nip.io and it resolves to one like to localhost or something like that, or even the 127/8 network, it would block. I was wondering if it would make sense to enforce everyone actually to just say like, hey, you should try to resolve that address. And if you figure that out, you see that it's inside the 127/8, you just drop that, or like the one on IPv6.
That's the
Um, I,
ideal. Yeah, absolutely. Sorry, I thought you were done. Please keep going.
no, I was just trying to find where I saw that in which part of Kubernetes code or some controller. I can't remember, but I think it would be good to enforce that. Like we had enough problems on Ingress and Nginx with those kind of things as well, supporting external name. In fact, that was like the same thing on Gateway API. So I think it's some good enforcement to have. Even I guess we discussed about having the same thing on endpoint selector or EPP on GIE as well, right, Rob? Because it wasn't. I think even that one wasn't being properly considered, I guess. So I think we should have some sort of enforcement for that. Eventually, some UTUs for everyone. Worst case, like resolve, check, and
So Istio does do this so Istio's got some like JOT support stuff where the control plane will like do JWKS lookups. And we do this now, actually. Just recently we added stuff to where if you've got a DNS name, we'll actually have a custom dialer that will, at the last second before you open the connection, it'll check to see what IP address got resolved and block certain citers from a list. That's the ideal way to really prevent this is for the data plane proxy to be able to have this last mile filtering after DNS is done and say, no, we're not going to go to this. The problem is that sort of feature is missing in most proxies that I'm aware of. I looked through the Envoy docs and did not really see anything to be able to prevent that. Um, yeah, I couldn't figure that out. If maybe I'm by no means an Envoy expert, so if folks know of a way to do that with Envoy, please let me know. Um, it's not super difficult to build, um, but it's just a matter of getting that rolled out to different proxies and users. But absolutely, long term, I say folks who've got um, you know influence with those different proxy communities, we should definitely advocate for adding those types of features because that's really I think the best we can possibly do to prevent that sort of attack.
yeah, agreed.
Rob, if you're talking, you're muted.
My last thing was to say, go ahead, Ricardo, because I thought Ricardo was saying something like Ed, but I was muted. Okay, all right. I've had this one up for a bit. This is this old CVE that is talking about endpoint slices, but then it kind of throws in this and by the way thing, and that is related to external name services. But what it calls out is not so like a lot of our community is very focused on ingress controllers, gateway controllers running inside the cluster that have approximately the same level of network access as other workloads running in the same cluster, approximately, right? And so in that case, what you become really nervous about is kind of like local host, those kinds of things, like exposing things on the ingress or gateway data plane itself. Uh, what since I represent an implementation that is programming things outside of the cluster, those things outside of the cluster may be able to see even more. And so that makes this kind of external name service that much, yeah, it shouldn't say external name, just any kind of DNS resolution that much scarier, because we, are potentially granting access to something that a user could not directly see or access themselves. So confused deputy feels ripe here. Um, I I don't think there's a way to write conformance tests for this because it's so environment specific, but it does need to be part of our guidance, that you need to have some way to mitigate this if you're choosing to support the API. One way is you have approximately the same level of access, so there's no real way to do privilege escalation. And the other is you find a way to approximate that level of access. And I mean, those aren't the only two ways, but those are two possible ways to resolve this one. But I just don't want to miss the other aspect here. Um, yeah, cool. I think that's all on this topic. Keith, did you have any other parts that you thought would be worth discussion on this?
Yes, the big one at this moment, if you will scroll up to, I believe, the first comment from Nick.
This
And
one?
yes, this one. And it changed recently, but this is good context. So, um, like I said, what's being shown on the screen here is not the current state of the PR. But there, because this backend resource started in AI Gateway, one of the things that we're trying to do is to try to see, okay, how can we tell a gateway implementation, hey, you should proxy this as MCP, you should proxy this as um, going to some external LLM like OpenAI or Vertex, etc. And part of the design is to have a protocol field where we have different options. One potential way of expressing that in the API is what you see here with this sort of opaque map string representation of uh, vendor prefixed protocols. Um, and we looked at this and I went away from this because I think Nick's point here is very sound that you're just, the temptation will be out there for implementations to just put a bunch of functionality here and never align with standards that might emerge properly in the API. So what I did initially, and I wanted to get sort of the gateway community's thoughts on this, is I started with just one protocol, MCP. And if I don't know if you want to click there, Rob, you don't have to. But in the actual PR, like Go spec, you can see types for MCP protocol options, and there are two fields within there for version and something else. Yeah, version and path for where the MCP is going to be served. And the way this would work is that the user says, "Hey, this port on this backend is going to be of the MCP protocol type." And then you've got specific protocol options that can be set. In this case, it would be MCP protocol options. I know that it's somewhat controversial, the degree to which specific protocols within AI are or not going to be long lasting. And potentially there might be some hesitation towards putting something like this in Gateway API before we know its staying power. I would prefer to try it, at least in experimental, to avoid sort of that opaque map representation in the API. I think having MCP be there is sort of the lesser of two evils. If the protocol ends up fading, it'll just be a part of the API that people won't use. But wanted to bring this up to see if folks had other ideas for how to represent this or how to accomplish some of these goals, um, or anything like that, or other feedback. Why MTP specifically, by the way? This actually comes from trying to create a harmony of of a proposal from three different groups here in Gateway API for egress, and working group AI Gateway for sort of the LLM use case. And then lastly, for agentic networking. Agentic networking has sort of a prototype for a backend resource. And I would love for this resource to be able to have, to solve the agentic networking use case so that we can sort of all join hands and sing Kumbaya on one backend implementation. And so the MCP protocol bit is an attempt to try to reach out to the agentic networking community and see if it'll be useful for them. So I see, Lior, you've got your hand up representing agentic networking. Love to hear any and all feedback from you or others on this.
Yeah, thanks, Kate. Right, like that's great, and I think we've been discussing on on this backend resource last week for at least a few times. But yeah, just for this, like also like seeing port and seeing this MCP right protocol and everything. It's just that I still the long-standing question is like, if you did edit back, I haven't seen it like, but I haven't seen the updated version, but like it would be useful for targeting requests towards an external tools, MCP tools, but then I'm still like, if we are not able to target a service and kind of discuss the implications, so I'm not like strictly sure what's the guidance we provide for people who have MCP tools within their cluster and still want this enforcement on the gateway, which seems to be a valid use case. So obviously we went through a lot of iterations last meeting we had with all the endpoint selection and reference and stuff like that, but I'm just wondering like if there's any gradual, like what's your updated thoughts about it?
For sure. And just to sort of add some more color to that for folks who haven't been a part of those conversations. Right now, really for controversy's sake and for simplicity's sake, I've taken out the backend type of service from the proposal as it stands today, just to try to create a somewhat clear separation between TLS configuration. And in my mind, it's simple. If you're a service, then you're targeting the service, you're going to use backend TLS policy. Targeting a backend, you're going to do inline policy. Um, Leo brings up a good point, though, right? Like, there's a lot of cool stuff in here, including the MCP protocol, that we might want to use to describe an internal service as well. Or if you're using Gateway API Inference Extension, you might want to describe an LLM that's running inside your cluster as well. How do you get this backend goodness when you're using a service? And so there are two different approaches we could do here. One, we could try to, and yes, we do need that thread in SIG Network to get this kicked off. But one, we could actually just have backend have a type of service and do it like that. We'd have to figure out how to deal with, what happens if you've got TLS defined in the backend and a backend TLS policy on the service. How does that work? So, that's one option. But the other option is, and this is the direction I'm leaning the most, the other option is to sort of say, hey, there's going to be a backend of type endpoint selector. And whether it is having the backend declare endpoint selector specifically, explicitly, just with a set of labels selectors, or whether we have a standard selector CRD/type that and this would require some more Kubernetes machinery. It's a bigger conversation. But basically have a backend to be able to target arbitrary endpoints inside the cluster to approximate the service use case. And I like that direction for a number of reasons. It's just harder to pull off. And so once we get that thread from Lior, I'd love to discuss ways you can make that happen. But yeah, that's where I currently stand on it. I like to try to have backend be able to target endpoints and be able to deliver a lot of this functionality to service through that direction.
Yeah, +1. I'm also leaning towards this. The only thing that I think we should consider / looking at, and I don't know, maybe Rob have explored this before, is like what intersection would it have with K/K, and like how much of effort, like how do we track all this coordination and leading this coordination to conclusion? And yeah, I mean, for agentic net, for this to be super useful, like it would have to also have a way to target things in cluster. And ideally, we provide the same experience for in cluster and outside a cluster through this resource, because obviously this resource is also kind of a wrapper, or like, it shows you how to, do TLS1, like saying, okay, this service is now MCP, therefore I should, inspect the MCP at a gateway and all that, attaching policies to it, to the backend. So, but obviously there's many use cases where the tools are in the cluster. So, yeah, I will start this thread, but I don't know if anyone else has any opinions, because I remember the endpoint selector resource has been useful and came up in many discussions beyond that.
Yeah, I don't know. I'm really nervous about the too many ways to do the same thing. I get that we're stuck between, rock and a hard place here of we ended up with policies because we didn't control service and we couldn't fit this stuff in service. And now we have something that isn't service, so we could fit it all inside, but then we end up with the way to do it on service and the way to do it on everything else. With inference pool, we made kind of a different decision of we'll just copy the way we did it on service and use backend TLS policy to target inference pool as well as service. I don't know. I I don't know how I feel about it. Go ahead, Leon.
I was saying, like, to cut you off right now, it's like it's just that the inference pool feels like it could very much benefit from it, because I think all or most, if not all, the implementations I'm familiar with are actually creating services behind the scene, right? And this is because of the reason of, like,
inference pool could benefit from endpoint selector 100%. Yes.
Yeah.
I am very, very much convinced that endpoint selector is something like we should do.
Okay.
What I'm talking about is, to be clear, is this, where this could be represented by backend TLS policy today.
Can I convince you that it can't? But that it can't in a future-proof way.
Okay. Tell me more.
And I thought about this after discussing with Leo a bit.
I'll talk with the kids about this too, and I was convinced by this. So yeah.
Okay.
Let's see if I can summarize it. If I can recall this well, Mike, let me know if I'm missing something. But the big reason why I don't think that backend TLS policy can do this well in a future-proof way is because we've said in the proposal, and we've talked about the need for backend to be a purely consumer-side resource. The problem with having backend TLS policy is because backend TLS policy is written from the perspective of the service owner, meaning it's a producer resource. And we'd essentially be coupling forever a consumer side resource in semantics and backend with a producer side policy and backend TLS policy.
That is true of what exists today. But John had a vision which I generally agree with, which hopefully will happen in this release, that makes backend TLS policy useful for a gateway owner.
With the different namespaces, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. I'm aware of that. I think my concern with that is it effectively requires the backend to exist in a different namespace than the client.
Mm-hmm.
What? No. One sec. I mean, theoretically, it could exist in the same namespace, but then we don't distinguish between owners in the same namespace, right?
Yeah,
like, theoretically, you could have a backend TLS policy targeting a backend, meaning it informed the clients. right?
It's basically the same scope gap as HTTP root and why you can't have like a consumer HTTP root in the same namespace because in the same namespace it's producer policy for gamma type things.
Uh, but like, what does it mean you cannot have HTTP route in the same namespace as consumer? Like, because HTTP route inside a namespace, like I don't understand what does it mean. Like when you do an HTTP route inside a namespace targeting a service in a namespace, then your clients in the namespace will get this config, right?
Yes, but it's producer policy. So it would be any client and not only clients within that namespace.
Right. Right.
So you're basically saying any client that's in a namespace can now dictate the policy for every other client in the cluster by default.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so, to go back to your question, Rob, like that's my main issue with not Rob's, you're Rob, with John's proposal. I think it is no worse than what we have today, but it's a somewhat similar thing of we have this core problem. We can, in my mind, we've got a choice. We can either try to keep on, we can try to keep on with and sort of build this complexity into all of our resources that we try to create forever, or we can bite the bullet and take the pain now. Because today is the simplest it's ever going to be when it comes to making a change like this.
Keith, can you say like, just help me understand fully, like, can you say in one sentence, or so are we saying that I understand are we saying that the backend, so are we saying we want to be able to provide to override consumer TLS policies for traffic within a namespace, or are you saying like we wouldn't, like the backend would have to live somewhere that I missed? Like if it's the former, I understand. Like we wouldn't be able to override consumer TLS policy for same namespace, or it's something else?
I think the key is that backend is not the semantics are not override when it comes to backend. The semantics are for the clients governed by this backend. This is how TLS is going to be handled. So whereas in the REST Gateway API, we tend to think about it in the sense of, okay, there's this default that is set by the service owner, and then the consumer can override that default. From a backend perspective, we don't care what the producer has said. We have no knowledge what the producer has said. We're just saying these are how our clients are going to behave. And that is, I think, the fundamental issue with the fundamental issue with with John's proposal and backend is that if you've got a backend TLS policy in a namespace attached to a backend in that same namespace,
Yeah.
then that backend TLS policy, if they happen to be coupled with the server, I need to mention that as well. If they happen to be coupled with the server in the same namespace,
If
that
the what?
backend,
What's the sentence? If they what?
if the backend,
Yeah.
the client, and the server
Yeah.
are all in the same namespace,
Yes.
the backend TLS policy no longer decorates the backend; it decorates the server and becomes a default for all clients, not just clients in that namespace.
Unless you provide a semantics where, like, if backend TLS policy targets a backend, then it's different, right? Like say backend TLS policy targets a backend, we're saying that's only ever consumer. Now backend TLS policy targeted service, that's only ever producer. We could say, I mean, I'm not sure if that will be acceptable. That's definitely not what have been discussed with John proposal, which aim to do it like, cross namespace and targeting a service still. But like brainstorming now, like you could say you override consumer whatever you target a backend, right?
You could ostensibly say that, okay, that when you have a backend TLS policy targeting the backend, it is now it's consumer only. what happens, what happens when you've got, because it's target refs on backend TLS policy. So what happens when
Yeah.
you've got a backend and a service?
You disallow it with VAP. That's easy.
But okay, so now we're at like three different layers of like workarounds for, again, is all comes from trying to work around
Not with
not being able
VAP,
to
I
change
meant with
service.
cell, by the way. But sorry. Yeah.
Yeah, VAP itself. Sure, we can do it, but again, my point is we're putting all this effort to try to preserve a status quo that's awkward. Is sort of my point. Whereas I think we can come up with semantics that are cleaner. So, for example, if we do endpoint selector, it seems like we're getting towards some alignment that we do endpoint selector. Then it becomes, I think, easier, right? If your backend ref is a backend of type endpoint selector, it's very easy. You've got the TLS inline, and we never have a type of service. And then it's very clear. Backend TLS policy is for service. Inline TLS would be for backend. And this way, you could do inline TLS for inference pool. You could do inline TLS for a VM, so a resource representing VMs. Anything that's got an Istio workload entry, you can create a backend for anything that has a target's endpoints. I think that's worthwhile to do that once and not have to try to just hope and pray that backend TLS policy will solve every use case without breaking other use cases. And I've spoken well longer than I wanted to on this topic, so I will happy to cede the floor to the
No,
other
no,
topic.
this is interesting. A follow-up question, since you mentioned inference pool in particular, like I want to have endpoint selector here. I would love to see that happen. What let's imagine a world we have endpoint selector, we have this backend resource, and we have inference pool. I can see how this backend resource and inference pool and endpoint selector kind of layer on top of each other. I can see how inference pool can just use endpoint selector as an implementation detail of inference pool, and so I see how that kind of layers fairly neatly. What I'm less clear of is how we do this TLS config. Do we literally just copy and paste this? Like every config that's in backend also gets pulled across to inference pool? Maybe? Like what, or is there some like higher level thing that is backend supposed to be a thing that comes up in front of inference pool, or like what?
That would be
How does all
my
this layer?
that would be my assumption, right? So you create an inference pool starting from the gateway API inference extension persona. You create an inference pool, and then you say, okay, I've got to select a rep to create the endpoints for my inference pool. And then I need to be able to add TLS to these connections because I want all of my inference to happen encrypted, for example. And so then you create a backend for that inference pool that then has the TLS information right there in line. And then the gateway knows when you're talking
But
to an endpoint from this endpoint, an endpoint from this backend, you would use TLS. Am I
so then
mixing that up?
we've kind of, for the inference story, we've actually like flipped it, but we haven't made anything easier per se. We've said route points to backend points to inference pool, whereas before, like today, we're saying uh, route points to inference pool, backend TLS policy points to inference pool. So we still
Yeah,
have three things, but
it's a little bit better for implementations, I'll say, because
yeah.
right now when you say backend points to inference pool, your implementation has to know how to figure that out, right? You need to create a shadow service, you do stuff internally. There aren't actually any endpoints in the cluster for that inference pool.
Well, no, but right, but you could, like, endpoint selector is what makes that better, right? Endpoint selector is the thing that becomes an implementation detail of inference pool instead of this like service, shadow service, whatever we want to call it thing.
Sure.
But
But then what do you do is your backend ref an inference pool, and then you've got to go within, because there's your backend is your backend ref an endpoint selector resource, or is it an inference pool? So it's the same question. Because the semantics today
Yeah.
is just generic inference pool.
Yeah.
With backend, at least you get a way to describe protocol, you get to describe TLS, etc. Multiple ports.
Well, inference pool does multiple ports too, but the interpretation of multiple ports in inference pool is meaningfully different than other backends. It's like
That is true.
every distinct port is actually a different endpoint in that, which feels weird, but that is useful. Okay,
Yeah,
well,
that's true.
I think honestly, I think I could be okay with this if the answer is we just keep this in sync. Like we imagine a world where we have multiple backend types defined in Gateway API, and then they all share, just similar to how like routes all have the same status struct,
Yes.
basically,
Yes.
and the same parent ref struct. And so backend refs all have the same like TLS struct, maybe.
Yeah.
That seems okay to me, I think. And then backend TLS policy becomes a thing that is only useful for quote unquote legacy backends, but uh I don't know. I need to think that one through some more, because John's point with his change to backend TLS policy was that this is really the kind of configuration that you want your gateway persona to own. And in this case, backend, we're kind of assuming the person who is configuring this specific kind of backend is the client.
Because it's
Whereas when you start,
egress. Because that's the
right.
difference. It's egress. And so the application developer is it's in a different spot in the pipeline, right?
So okay, should we really just go ahead and call this this is the thing that I've been unsure about. Should we call this just egress backend then? Or is the goal to have like LLMs in cluster? But then if it's LLMs in cluster, the persona is not necessarily just, the client. It could be the owner of the in-cluster LLM.
That's a good. I agree with Ricardo. I think you call it service V2. I, I think it depends on how you define egress. Just based on the discussion on that egress gateway proposal, I lean towards not calling it egress because everybody's going to think of it differently. But I
Sure.
think if you take a very specific definition of egress to say this is going to control how traffic from my client reaches its destination,
Yeah.
then I think that that would fit. Whether that destination is outside of a cluster and you're going through a gateway, or that destination to east west is going east west to another service internally, um, then I think it makes sense. And like if you've got a certain, thinking about Istio, I would probably have Istio support just reading backends without having an egress gateway in the middle. And in that
Yeah.
sense, it would be sort of governing that backend hop. That
Yeah.
egress
No.
hop. It just depends on where the proxy is. If there's only
Yeah.
one
No.
proxy, you've got to have a gateway. Yeah.
My main point is I buy that this makes TLS config on the back end makes sense when this is a client only resource, which kind of infers that this exists either in a different place than the back end, like than the workload, or I don't know. But the second you start to use this same thing to point to things inside the cluster, you get the same messy persona story that we have with backend TLS policy today. And we've recreated the same policy because the same problems, because we're assuming to start, well, this is only outside the cluster, so whatever. But then it might be inside the cluster, and that's, I don't know. If Even if we don't call it egress backend, if we call it out of cluster backend, whatever. I'm not actually proposing that name, but just trying to distinguish, because that I think is kind of tied tightly with whether TLS inline makes sense, just in terms of persona. But I do realize, sorry, I realize I've taken a lot of the time on this, so let's wrap it up in like 2 minutes or something. And my things are quick, so whatever.
Sure. Like the last thing I'll say, and then I'll be done is, my personal opinion, and I don't necessarily have a right to have this opinion because I wasn't super around during back in TLS policies development, and for that I apologize. But I think back in TLS policies, Genesis as a producer resource is a distortion versus sort of the ideal. I think it's a distortion because it's meant to solve the ingress use case where you've got something with traffic coming from outside the cluster with no context being hydrated by the gateway with cluster context and going to destination in cluster. In that case, you're telling this gateway how to talk to my backend, therefore it is producer policy. I don't think that is necessarily how you think about TLS inside the cluster. I don't think producer side semantics make a lot of sense. And again, that comes from my bias as a mesh person, where most of my time is spent thinking east-west. But I would go so far as to say I think the only place back in TLS policies producer semantics makes sense is on that ingress hop. And so personally, I think it's a bit of a mistake to try to generalize that pattern, because TLS I just see that as a purely consumer side thing. So I'll put that out there. I've taken more than enough time. I appreciate everybody's attention. Happy to follow up, and I'll be looking out for your thread in Slack, Lior.
Yeah. No, I'm overdue for a review here, but this was a very useful, at least for me, discussion. So thank you. Cool. All right. Just a heads up. There's an issue out here that is proposing that a good chunk of gateway inference extension moves out to LLMD. There's a lot more detail and discussion than this, but this is just maybe the first issue that kind of discussed it. This has been discussed at GIE meetings, SIGNet meetings, and some other stuff. I think just a whole bunch of open source meetings. I figured it's relevant to this group too, because I think what's left is really only going to be stable APIs and probably just inference pool and corresponding conformance. So we'll try and have a more concrete proposal, hopefully sometime this week, knock on wood, to actually pull in inference pool into this repo. And if we were able to do that, I think this would kind of this repo might actually become archived in the next few months. It's not going to happen overnight, but eventually. And that's not to say the project is dead, anything but. One of the things I'd always hope for endpoint picker and inference extension is that we would have many endpoint pickers, and we have finally at long last reached that point. I think there's 3 from VLLM, there's 1 from NVIDIA, and then I think there's 1 or 2 others. I don't know. There's others, and so having we've kind of blurred the line between here's a library where you can make an endpoint picker, and here's like a fully fledged production ready endpoint picker. And I think I'd like to just keep the library parts inside Kube and then let the rest go out. So that's basically what this is proposing. So we focus on contract and API inside Kube, and then the ecosystem can go evolve at whatever speed they like, and I expect that to be quite quickly. Anyway, hopefully no surprises there. It's been a lot. There's a ton of overlap in this group and other groups that have already discussed this, but just wanted to bring it up for heads up and awareness. And the last one, there's KubeCon next week. So yay. I am very sad I won't be there, but very excited for the folks that will. Amsterdam is a really fun place to have a conference like that. I hope the folks that are going have fun. And also, if you are there, we do have our first ever Gateway Dev Summit on the Monday. And I want to make sure anyone, like if you're attending this call, you almost certainly belong at the Dev Summit. So, if you don't know how, if you aren't already invited, just ping me or anyone really, and we'll make sure you can get there. With that, I think that's all we have today. Any last items? Cool. All right. Well, thanks, folks. Have a good week. And for folks who aren't at KubeCon, well, yeah, I guess for folks like me, we'll see you in a couple weeks. And with that, have a good rest of your week. See you.
Take care, y'all.
Bye.
Bye, folks.